They called it a wedding. She called it a funeral. At 12 years old, Margaret Beaufort knew exactly what her wedding night would cost her. What nobody expected was that she'd survive it, outsmart every single man who tried to control her, and build a dynasty from the ashes of her childhood. But first, she had to endure something that would break most adults. This is her story, and I promise you it's darker than anything you've seen in historical dramas. Picture this: England, 1450. You're 6 years old, and you've just inherited one of the largest fortunes in the kingdom. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Wrong. Because in medieval England, a 6-year-old heiress wasn't a child. She was a walking bank account with a womb attached. And every power-hungry lord in the country wanted a piece. Margaret Beaufort's father had just died, leaving her with lands, titles, and a target on her back the size of Yorkshire. Within months, the king himself, Henry VI, decided her fate. She would marry his half-brother, Edmund Tudor. The age difference? He was 24. She was 7 years old when the betrothal was finalized. Let that sink in for a second. 7. The same age kids today are learning multiplication tables and losing teeth. Margaret was being legally contracted to a grown man. And this wasn't some fringe scandal. This was standard operating procedure for the nobility. Child marriages were investments, political chess moves, where the pieces were actual children. The law technically said girls had to be 12 before consummation, but that law had more holes than a moth-eaten tapestry. And here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval betrothals. The ceremony might look like a wedding, but it was really a transaction. Margaret stood in that chapel, barely tall enough to see over the altar, while men discussed her dowry, her lands, her breeding potential like she was livestock. The ring they placed on her finger? Too big. It kept sliding off. They had to wrap it with cloth just to keep it on. Even the symbolism was screaming that this child did not fit into this role. But the wedding was just the beginning. What came next was worse. For the next 5 years, Margaret lived in this bizarre limbo. Legally married, but too young for anyone to publicly acknowledge what that meant. She was shipped between estates, educated in the arts of needlework and household management, all while physicians periodically examined her to determine when she'd be ready. And by ready, I mean ready to produce an heir. These weren't gentle checkups. We're talking about grown men physically inspecting a child's body, discussing her development in clinical terms, waiting for signs of womanhood, like farmers watching crops ripen. The records from this period are chilling. Court documents refer to Margaret's physical development with the same detached interest you'd use to describe breeding horses. At age 12, everything changed. Margaret began menstruating, and the moment the household learned about it, her fate was sealed. In medieval times, first blood was treated like a starting gun. It meant you were now fair game. Edmund Tudor, who'd been waiting patiently for 5 years, received word that his child bride was now technically capable of bearing children. Technically. Because here's what the medieval medical establishment conveniently ignored. A 12-year-old's body might be able to get pregnant, but it absolutely should not. The skeletal system isn't fully developed. The pelvis is too narrow. The reproductive system is immature. Modern medicine calls pregnancy before age 15 high risk. Medieval doctors called it Tuesday. The consummation happened shortly after her 12th birthday. I'm not going to describe it in detail because YouTube has guidelines and you have an imagination, but understand this. Margaret was 4 foot nothing, barely 80 pounds, and had just started puberty. Edmund was a full-grown man. What happened in that bedchamber wasn't romance. It wasn't even close to consent. It was legalized brutality dressed up in silk sheets and wedding vows. And the worst part? The household celebrated it. Servants congratulated Edmund. Ladies-in-waiting prepared the traditional bloodied sheet display. Margaret's pain was proof of her transition from girl to woman, and everyone treated it like a milestone instead of a tragedy. But here's where Margaret's story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Within weeks of that night, she became pregnant. At 12 years old, her body, still growing, now had to support another life. The pregnancy was brutal. Constant sickness, dangerous complications, and a medical system that cared more about the baby than the child carrying it. Medieval physicians prescribed bloodletting, herbal concoctions that did nothing, and bed rest that left Margaret weak and malnourished. She spent months confined to darkened chambers, while her body tried desperately to handle something it was nowhere near ready for. The court physicians,